Hey, I'm Lurpus. I played Counter-Strike for a living for 8 years. I've been on the desk for some of the biggest events for 5 years. I know nothing about Counter-Strike, but then again, neither does Thorin. Welcome to his YouTube channel.
Hello, guys. What's up? I think maybe you want to bet. Maybe this is tricky, man. But maybe you want to bet esportspools. Whether your team is terrorist or counter-terrorist, they can do something good. Half tournament is joke anyway, man. SK is win all. For me, Cold Zero is the best anyway. I'm picking him every time at esports pools. Now, obviously, with SK Gaming as the number one team, the best team at the moment, the team that most people would pick as the favourite to win practically any tournament they enter at the moment. Obviously, yet to be seen what will happen because they can't play at the major and what will happen after, a solid month off. But the thought of having another elite team from Brazil is really something that's never had to cross our minds before in CSGO history, because having one elite team was amazing, and we didn't expect that to happen until suddenly, in early 2016, Luminosity delivered upon the amazing form they'd shown at that first tournament, DreamHack Winter, Face It Stage 3, in late November of 2015, and got over the ESL Pro League drop-off and started to rack together consistent top three places, and then obviously eventually went on to win the major at MLG Columbus. And suddenly we had an elite, world-class number one team that was Brazilian. And then people started to look at the Tempo Storm team, the team that became Immortals. Now the core of it has become 100 Thieves, and people started to think, well, can this team be good? And it was a decent enough team. Problem was, that team for most of its history, up until very recently, even actually around the time of the major, was still seen, quite rightly so, as something of a farm team for talent that might join SK one day, because it seemed like no player in that team was going to turn down an offer from SK. So they were stuck in the position that Dignitas and North used to be behind Astralis, where if your team gets really good, unless your team is really good and the other main team, Astralis or SK in this case, is very good as well, if their team, the bigger team, is slightly worse, you're going to leave either for more money or better chance of winning or to play with the better players. And so unfortunately, every time it gets good for you, in a way it gets bad for you because you get reset. But actually, the funny thing is, I actually think that the analogy carries further, because for me, by the time it got to the end of 2017, even though, yes, I think a lot of those players still would have left to go and join SK, as we saw with Bolts when the team had broken up, but I still think a lot of them would have said yes, pretty much no matter what, except perhaps in a scenario where Henny only will play with Lucas Swan, or Lucas will only play with Henny. Maybe that could have happened. But I think already in terms of the org support and how much they were being paid, and especially now, obviously, in a world where 100 Thieves has bought the core, they absolutely could have been in a position where, whether in terms of results they could have, but they could have vied for true supremacy within Brazil, and to be a team that has its own skill set and keeps its own core players and has its own identity, not just as this farm team feeding up in SK. So I also think another factor you have to throw in here is that already with the 100 Thieves lineup and the team that made it all the way to the final of the major in Immortals, you already had a good team. It wasn't an elite team by any means. It wasn't elite already at that point in time. It was way too inconsistent and streaky, and that, funnily enough, was the identity of the star players, the focal points in the team, and so it makes a lot of sense in that respect. But I actually also think if they could have kept that core together, I mean, obviously they have in a different context, but they haven't kept, for me, the supportive elements and the more calm elements in the team. So that's why I actually just seen them going to more of an extreme in 100 Thieves. I also thought the positive for them was that as long as SK was very good and was a team that was winning tournaments and was at the elite level at the top of the world, right, yes, SK might look to Immortals to take players, but I actually thought Immortals could themselves have benefited from having the rest of the Brazilian scene as a farm team for themselves. I realise now we've actually found that's not necessarily the case, because suddenly the buyouts for players on Luminosity and teams that you've never even heard of are suddenly high enough where they're prohibitive to some degree. But if any more talent did come up of the level of a Phelps, then I felt like they would have been the obvious people who could have benefited from that, and therefore that's how they might have been able to power up and get up near the SK level. I admit they're not going to be at the SK level for a start. They don't have an in-game leader as good as Fallen. They don't have a superstar player as good as Cold Zero. They don't have a luxury star player, superstar player like Fur. So you have to make a good team, and you're going to have to build it on style and on good balance of players. But I already felt like another factor that went in their favour is, if SK ever does have to make a roster move, then in theory, any player they kick out, with the exception of Taco, who's unlikely to be kicked out actually, and quite frankly, still could do a lot for a team like this. Any player they kick out of that team, it reminds me of what it used to look like in the old TSM Astralis team when they had Cajun B, Dupree, Device. You thought to yourself, any of these guys they kick out, it's just going to make the team below stronger, actually. You can get a really solid player there. And admittedly, Cajun B wasn't the player to be a superstar in North or Dignitas. But if they'd have kicked out Dupree, I absolutely think he would have gone ham in that team. And likewise, obviously they kicked out Phelps now, or technically he will be leaving the team. I'd be all over that if I was a squad like 100 Thieves. Likewise, if they ever, for whatever reason, motivation, maybe he just has a conflict with the players in the team, if they ever let a player like Fur go, what would he fucking do in a team like this, in a secondary team where he was the main star, and maybe you even build the style of the team around him, whereas at the moment, I think he pushes the limits of the style of the SK system, and he's just so good at it, they let him get away with it, and it creates all these opportunities, but I don't think that's the SK style, really. I think they're a lot more coordinated, and he gets to have more of a free reign, and the rest of them team play around each other more, and play off what he's kind of creating impromptu, using his intuition, and his very, very aggressive style, and his predilection for dueling people in the game aggressively. So, like I say, if you took Fern, you put him onto a lesser team like this, and then you built the team around him, I mean, this guy would be winning MVPs at all sorts of events. He would actually vie for best player in the world, especially because he's so aggressive. I think he'd be a massive fan favourite. In that sense, it's always actually been a bit puzzling. I get that people appreciate Cold Zero because he's so incredible in terms of what he can do in a game, as in the way he can control a game, he can control his opponents, he's so consistent, he knows all the angles, he knows where to be, he knows how to outthink people, how to outplay them, how to play his spots nearly to perfection. He has great technique, which makes his aim, that isn't the best in the world at all, look fantastically polished, and you never notice that he doesn't have great aim. I mean, you're not seeing amazing highlights, but he's getting all the kills, so it doesn't matter. Even so, there's logical reasons as to why a fan who just wants the fireworks and the flash and the sheer highlight plays would definitely latch onto a player like Fur a lot more. And I think actually Fur, in that sense, is much more Brazilian as a player. He captures more of the traditional Brazilian Samba style of Counter-Strike. I think they actually love, as you saw in these other teams. I always used to make this point. When Tempo Storm and Immortals got good, I always used to say, don't say that SK plays Brazilian style Counter-Strike, because they don't really, actually. They play quite a tactical game, especially the 2016 lineup, with a lot of team play and trying to make intelligent reads on the opponent and then counter what the opponent's doing and then break the opponent's system as well, draw the opponent into making mistakes. I don't think that actually was able to really work at all in the Immortals and Temple Storm. They did play a lot more fast-paced, a lot more streaky, AWPs all over the place, playing aggro Counter-Strike, doing things all over the place, impromptu, in intuitive plays, but multiple players all over the map. They were, if anything, more in the line with like the ridiculous Fnatic lineups that pushed that style to the very limits, and that's actually more Brazilian-style Counter-Strike, actually. They don't have as much of a tactical base historically going back. They either play around superstar players like Cold Zero, like Fur, like, well, if you go back far enough, Kogu, Fallen at one point in time. But generally they weren't those more tactical teams who necessarily had all the games scouted out. So I think actually Fur would thrive. He might even be even better in a team, not in terms of results, obviously, he's not going to win as many tournaments, but as an individual player, he would look amazing, just as if you took some of the amazing players in the NBA who are the second or third best player on their team, and you put them onto their own team, yeah, they'd go ham. Klay Thompson, you take someone like Kyrie Irving, put them on their own team, they'll be fucking beasts, and they'll be better than they were actually playing a little bit more of a restricted role, or one where they weren't the main star necessarily, with a bigger star who's arguably a better all-around player. Now, with all that said, I think the talent is already there to make another elite Brazilian team. And I don't think it's 100 Thieves, unfortunately. Like, I think 100 Thieves has a chance to be very streaky because of the lineup they've got, and therefore they'll have upsets, and maybe that can mean one or two really deep runs. But I don't see them being elite, which means being consistent, having a lot of placings, contending to actually win championships, being good enough to consistently beat the teams below you, and then take the top teams close and really be able to beat them sometimes and contend for those big titles. So, I'll set up the conditions of how I made this concept. You're not allowed any SK players of the current five-man lineup. For obvious reasons, why would they break that team up? They wouldn't, right? I'm assuming that the org we're talking about has the money for buyouts and that the players are willing to join the team, and the players in the team that I'm naming off now are willing to let these players join. So obviously it's a hypothetical scenario. And then I'm also not just putting together amazing players. I'm trying to build a team that has some balance to it, that has a logic to how they might play, the sort of maps that might be good on, the roles that they would have, and therefore can be legitimately world-class because the pieces make sense. There's a balance to their style. And so I start at the top. I want my superstar player. Well, outside of Cold Zero, outside of Fur, there's one player who I think you could build a team around who could be a superstar as good as anyone in the world, and that is Phelps. I already thought he was amazing when he first joined SK, but he was clearly restricted. He clearly was never given the full focus of the team, the full resources to be the main star, because he plays with Fur, because he plays with coldzera. Was never going to happen for him in that sense. He was still very good and he won championships as a result of being a lesser player. But you put him into a team. I realize in Immortals, he sometimes lacked for a bit of direction and maybe he had too much freedom. I think he's a player with superstar potential. I think now he's had a taste in SK of what it means to win, what it means to be in those massive matches, how to remain composed, poised under pressure. Don't just think of him at the end when he was having problems, and specifically on one map. He was being a fantastic player earlier in the year, and he really looked like, in terms of mentality, he was starting to buy into that mentality, and the aura was starting to kind of transfer to him from players like coldzera, like Fallen, who were very, very clutch players. And he started to get that sort of champions mentality. And I thought they had transferred that. So I feel like he could bring some of that to this squad, which traditionally that's been a flaw of the Immortals, of the Temper Storm squads. They had the talent to already be much better, but they didn't have the mentality. And especially, obviously, when they played teams like SK and the world-class teams, they tended to break down unless they were just hitting all the wild shots that they could. That's the only way they would break through it. And I'll give credit to players like Henny. I don't think he necessarily had a mental problem in that sense. I think he's just a very streaky player, and that accounts for his low level of play at times against the elite opposition. So I want Phelps as my superstar player here, and I think if you build the team around him, aggressive playmaker, give him a lot of decision as to when he initiates this play, you're not going to see the flaws that you saw in SK towards the end when the team was tested, because the way out is through. He's going to push through that. He's going to be overly aggressive. He's going to become I guess it's not really fair to compare him to Config because he's not that kind of mad aggression, but he's certainly up there. I mean, when people say he's a poor man's Fur, that is not a bad thing at all, because Fur is so exceptionally good at that right now that anyone who's even close to Fur, so you can be a poor man and still be a very good player. I think he could be as good as Fur if he is given the time to continue to develop and given the right team around him and a little bit of direction, but not too much. So my direction is going to come from what's implicit within the team, the balance of the players, the mentality of the players, who else's strengths are there to cover up some of the flaws of a Phelps. I want some team players. I want some players who communicate, players with a bit of cerebral ability, but players who can do it themselves. It doesn't have to be a team system, because I think that's what's going to hamper and limit a player like Phelps. So the player I want alongside Phelps as my star player is obvious to me. It's KNG, because I saw this guy when he joined that Immortals team, and he was a revelation. Now, listen, he is a very streaky player because of how aggressive he is, because of how confident he seemingly is in his own aim, his own ability to take fights. But that's good. I want a bit of confidence. I want someone to go along with Phelps who seems like at times he can suffer from a little bit of a lack of confidence. Phelps reminds me a little bit of Flamey in that sense. I don't think that Phelps really realizes how good he actually is. And sometimes he plays players who I think are worse than him, or definitely just comparable at best. And it starts to go badly, and he starts thinking, oh, this guy has my number, I'm not having a good game. A superstar sometimes needs that special arrogance, that special confidence, and I see that in KNG. Sadly, it's also manifested in a negative sense in terms of the social media and some of the components of not being professional, sure. But if we ignore that for this hypothetical team, I think he could be very good, because this guy was a good fragger. And when you add his numbers to his style of play, I think actually his ability to frag was a bit better than the numbers said, because I think he took a lot of chances and therefore he died a lot more than players who I think are not quite as good as him as fraggers actually, but come up with better KPR and better stats for a tournament will seemingly appear better on paper, but I don't think they are if you watch it in the game. And with Phelps on my team, he doesn't have to be the main star. So already, I don't have to worry as much about his inconsistency. Whereas for me, he was far and away the best player in Immortals in terms of fragging power and star potential. I mean, you could make an argument best all-round player was probably Bolts, but best star player was already KNG. So if he doesn't have to be my main star, and he can just be a running mate with Phelps even, and they can do it by committee, and in terms of one of us doesn't have to be a true superstar, top 5 player in the world, just the two of us could contend to be top 10 players. Now we're cooking with gas. Now we've got some legit firepower, and it has a logic to it. We've balanced it out a bit more. Then you've got to consider KNG is a hybrid player. We know he likes to pick up the AWP. Now, I actually thought playing with Henny was a mistake, because, now, not in terms of his career choices, he had no choice. Henny had a lock over that team mentally, and in terms of they weren't going to kick him for some reason, because he was kind of the heart and soul of the team in terms of his style of play. They did kind of go as far as he could take them. But I think KNG is actually a better AWPer than Henny. I think he's got better tracking aim with the AWP. Yes, he'll still play very aggressively, and he'll certainly play sometimes more in your face, like Henny does. But I actually think it's more logical as to what he can do with an AWP. Whereas Henny, for me, would hit the outrageous shots, and I never really got what he was trying to do on all the other scenarios, and I could see how he was a liability at times. So I want him as my AWPer, but I'm not going to make him be the AWPer all the time. He'll be the AWPer when he feels like he's going to remain a hybrid player, because this team, I'm going to make the style more of a 5-rifle team with occasional AWPs when they're feeling it. Then I'm going to take FNX, and I want FNX right in the middle of the pack. And the reason I want him here is because FNX has massive experience, and I want him to be able to employ that, not just as a supportive player playing like bit trolls or whatever. I want him to actually have a little bit of firepower. I want him to have some control over some elements of the team. I definitely want him to be more late game in the equation, because this guy's a sick clutcher. That is not an overrated quality of him. Sure, towards the end of SK, he had his troubles. That's an area where he started to fall down. Clutching already is a streaky thing anyway. If you go watch people I think are some of the best clutches ever, Crims, Zipniks, they can't do it every tournament, because winning clutches, it's unlikely that you win those scenarios quite often, quite frankly. But if you want to see this guy at his peak, at his prime in CSGO, go and watch one of the first amazing series he had in CSGO, which was the semi-final of the aforementioned first tournament of the lineup, where he joined and played with Taco and Cold Zero and Fallen, which was the DreamHack Winter 2015 event, which was Face It Stage 3. It was held at DreamHack Winter. And in the semi-finals, they played TSM, the Danish team that basically became Astralis not long afterwards. And for this whole series, this guy fucking goes off, like big time. And especially the third map, which is Inferno, which is a good map for TSM, and which for TSM were odds on to win and put themselves in a position when it was overtime. The only reason they win this map and go to the final of Play Fnatic is because of FNX. He just clutches all over the place, key kills all over the place. He had a massive impact. Now, he's not going to do that very often, and we saw when he joined Immortals and his motivation was sapped. He was a good, at times, could do some of this shit, but wasn't like some all-around consistent player. But I'm hoping with this team, it's going to play more to other people's strengths, and then he's going to have a lot of this on himself, and he's going to get to dictate a lot of the late game action, that this is going to kind of fire him up again. Because I don't think in CSGO he has the star power he did in 1.6. I don't think he's going to be that player ever again, quite frankly. You also have to throw in, he has shown some attitude issues, in as much as he loses motivation, or the grind gets to him, or he's another person who wants to party, who wants a bit more leisure time, who wants to be a bit more free and enjoy the luxury and the wealth of the position he's in now that he wouldn't have had if he'd been back in Brazil, perhaps. But you know what? In this lineup, I'm not building it to be around for 3 years and to have to compete and always be at the highest level like SK has to. Just give me 6 good months of FNX. Give me 6 months where he's locked in. He wants to play 10 to 13 hours a day. He understands his role in the team. He sees the potential to win. And in fact, in this team, to win on his own terms, without Fallen, without Cold Zero, and to do it without those guys and say, I did it without you. And actually, you know what? I'm still a legend in this scene. That's the FNX I want to see in this team. And I think it would be a massive benefit in terms of that ability for these other players. I don't feel like we saw the real FNX when he was in Immortals before. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to throw in Lucas One. Now, in this team, I want him to be more of a supportive player, because I do actually think he was the player where when they came up as Games Academy and Tempo Storm, he wasn't the player I watched a lot, because obviously when Phelps was getting hot, I started to watch him a lot. Bolts looked like this really all-around player with really good head on his shoulders. Loving watching him play. Then KNG came, so obviously my eye came to KNG. I was watching him. Lucas was always the background player, but I did notice in a team that had very few supportive elements, except Bolts, he was the other player who seemed to hold some of the structure together, who seemed to allow some of those other players who were unduly aggressive and cocky and playmaking and trying to hit wild, crazy party piece shots. He kind of allowed that to be the case. It's actually really funny that he's obviously the twin of Henny, because it shows how different people are going to develop differently, even if genetically they're basically the same, because I don't see him as being anything like Henny actually as a player. So I think, funnily enough, even though in the real world it seems like he won't leave Henny, his twin brother, understandable, it's his brother, he gets a chance to play with him, I can see what the allure would be, probably sees more potential in them than I do. But if you could get him apart from Henny and put him in this team, I think him coupled with FNX, we've now got a really nice little supportive core here. And I have to say, especially this year, Lucas, I actually thought, stepped up his fragging. Like, he's not a great fragger, he's not a very good fragger, but he's actually like an underratedly decent fragger, actually. And he got to a much better level this year, because when I saw him play in 2016, I did think he was a bit of a bot the few times I focused on him, and his fragging level didn't seem that consistent or good, quite frankly, and I thought his numbers did display that, even though, admittedly, they were a streaky team, and they didn't necessarily go that far in tournaments, so most players in the team were having trouble statistically. But I think he improved that a lot this year. He shored up some of his game, and I can see why Fallen said, actually, if we wanted to recruit in terms of style, we would have taken this guy for FNX's spot, rather than taking Phelps and have to rework the team completely like they did at the beginning of 2017 when he came in for DreamHack Vegas onwards. So if I put him in, I think even in terms of fragging, as my 4th or 5th best player, he's going to give me something. Finally, I need my in-game leader, right? Now, this is where I've gone with a controversial move, because I realise Steel wasn't the in-game leader for Immortals for a very long time. But I'm going to make him the in-game leader because, first of all, I think he's a cerebral guy. I think he's got a very good head on his shoulders, a very calm head. And I think he's a guy who is hungry to study and to win at the game. But I'm also going to free him up a bit by making this a very loose team. We're going to play a very up-tempo, fast-paced, fragging, frantic, there's not even a word frantic, frenzied, frantic, firepower team that's going to play off a lot of individual play and then follow up with that and just swarm bomb sites. And we're going to play the maps that even works on. So I'm going to give him a loose calling style. So he only has to call the basics and do some scouting and just keep people roughly on paper with where we're going to be going as a team. And that's going to open him up to still be a fragger. Because I actually thought in Immortals, before the lineup split apart and before he went to Team Liquid, where he hasn't adjusted at all yet, I thought he actually was turned into a surprisingly decent fragger. I thought he wasn't very good when he was back in Luminosity, quite frankly. I thought he was one of the players that I thought struggled. Bolt struggled more in terms of mentality, and he hadn't developed this more all-around game. He was still a decent player, though. But Steel was the player where I could understand totally why they cut him, and I didn't think he really fit even the mentality of how they wanted to play in that team. He really improved that this year, I thought. And actually, like I say, in terms of fragging, I thought he was pretty good. So I think this team actually would have sleeper power in terms of fragging. It's never going to be some massive G2-esque team, but I think they would be pretty decent, actually. Now, you might ask, there's 2 players you've missed off here. Why aren't they on there? Why no Henny? Because obviously when he hits his peak, it looks super sick, right? Problem is he doesn't hit that level nearly enough. I actually think he was my pick earlier this year, along with Shroud, as I thought the most overrated players, because people would talk when they had the good moments as though they had the potential to be star players. I think neither of those players had potential in terms of either mentality or what they could actually consistently do in the game. They just had good moments. Now, another problem I think with Henny is, for me, he warps the style of the team too much. He means you have to kind of go all in on him in that really streaky style. And he also warps the economy too much, because I hate it when AWPers want the AWP all the time, but they aren't good enough to justify it. They can't do consistent things, they can't do the simple things, and they're only going at peak level and hitting crazy shots, but doing nothing else in between. And that's my problem. His AWP buys in his very, very aggressive peaks, I felt like he wasn't an AWPer that could hold angles, so I don't want that as my primary AWPer. I don't want to have to buy AWPs all the time that aren't going to do much, actually, sometimes. I think also, just logically, if you want him in your team, you probably have to buy into that risky style and play. Otherwise, then he's not going to be effective if he's just a positional AWPer in a strategical team. So I just don't see the point in having Henny if I want this team to be truly elite level. Now, the other player is the player they have currently as their in-game leader in 100 Thieves, which is Bit, or Bit1, the player who has been deep in ESWC, in majors in CS 1.6, has won decently sized international tournaments in 1.6, and sometimes without the likes of Kogu, and as an in-game leader, and has studied, and is one of the more tactical in-game leaders from Brazil with good experience. The problem is, I can't see whether that experience will really apply to CSGO. It's a different game, the meta is very different. Actually, a lot more teams play that aggressive individual style, a la the Brazilians, whereas in 1.6 was a lot more tactical, and there was a set meta game, and teams played a lot more positional. In fact, the Brazilians were quite unique in that sense, I thought. So I'll go ahead and I'll gamble on the fragging that Steel can give me, and the little period that I thought he was decent enough as an in-game leader and seemed like he had a sense for what to do with the team. But I'd rather gamble on Steel than bring back Bit, who hasn't shown me anything yet. Now, a key element to this team that they never had in Immortals, because the guy became a player in the team, is I want my coach to be Zeus. Because I think for this type of a team especially, he would be dynamite. Because he would be great for having simple calls he could give people to change things up when they're stuck for what to do. He can keep the energy up. He can keep the morale up. This is going to be a team that's going to play off that kind of infectious confidence and the cocky confidence of the KNGs and the FNXs of the world, but then big up players like Steel, like Phelps, to feel like they can win as well, and combining these elements together with Zeus, who can harmonize it. I feel like he could control the morale, control the enemy energy, motivate some of the players who need kind of a bit of a kick, who need a pat on the back at times. I also think, crucially, He's going to give me 6 months of FNX. He can keep FNX reined in because unlike anyone else in the scene, except maybe Fallen and maybe Cold Zero when Cold Zero was at his peak, I don't think anyone else really has the proper status and credibility and then also the ability to articulate themselves with someone like FNX to keep him on side. Because the thing about Zeus that not a lot of people know outside the Brazilian scene is, I know there's some talking to him and talking about his past and where he comes from, what type of guy he is. This is a real dude. He's come from some scary background situations where he wasn't one of these Brazilians that just came from a rich family and it was all great and he basically was living like an American style life outside of the rough areas. No, he's seen some shit. So as a result, he's a guy who doesn't take for granted that he's in this fabulous position right now where he can make all this money and have a massive impact on the game that he's played and been around for a long time and finally be at a relevant world level. So I think also he would be hungry to prove himself as a coach. I think he wants to fucking win a major, win big tournaments without SK to show that, yeah, you know what? I was a big part of that team that won majors. That's never won a major without me, and I want to show it off with a totally different team. And you know what, FNX, that player the rest of the scene thought we had to kick out because we couldn't work with him, I can bring him back on. He can be my project. I can bring FNX back on board, back online. I can actually get someone like KNG to tone down some of the other elements that were fucking his career up. And you know what, I can encourage Phelps to become that superstar player that he never did in SK. But you know what, I didn't work with him in SK. So I feel like Zeus, for me, would be an ideal person to head up this project, and he will keep some of the egos in check while also boosting the egos that we need boosting. Now, in terms of the map pool, I think they would have quite similar map pool to the Immortals team, because for me, this is a souped up version of Immortals. It's going to take all the strengths of Immortals. It's going to cover up some of the weaknesses of Immortals. And so I see their maps, right? The maps I think they would be strong on, I think you've got to go with Inferno, because it's such a streaky map. It's a map that you can play fast aggression on. You can explode onto the sites. You make one simple read, you go in. I know a lot of teams play the very slow meta, but I think that would work, and I think that's what worked for this team. And you can open up KNG's AWP. It's a mid-range. I think that's where he's at his best with the AWP. I think Cobblestone, every player in this team has been good at Cobblestone at certain points in time. It's a map where, again, you can explode onto sites. I think that they would be good for that, even though they're not going to be the most tactical team. I think we can use aggression and going all in on sites in that particular sense, and Cobble's a map that you still can do that to some degree. I think Cash, again, traditionally has been a map they've always been decent at. It's a skill map. You can play a bit more freeform. You can play a bit more off aim. Just simple one smoke, one flash. You go onto a site. Also, we've got some good clutches in this team, so I think that's a map that suits them with a lot of post-plant scenarios. And finally, I'll take Mirage, because just like Inferno, I think it's another map where aggressive CT side, I think the ability to play a fast up-tempo T side, once you have your stars like KNG, like Phelps, make the initial play, and then you just follow them up and burst onto the site. I think these four maps, at least 2 or 3 of these, they're going to be very good on. So that's going to set my tone. And by the way, in the current climate, being good on Inferno Mirage, that is a ticket to the top end of the scene right now. As conversely, Astralis' difficulties on those maps have been part of the reason that they have gone down in the rankings and gone down in ability to be a true world number one. Now, I actually think if Dust 2 came back, depending on what it replaced, that would be a good map for this team. Admittedly, it's not going to be a map where everyone's going to play massively different, but I think with this many skilled players and some good clutches, I think this would be a decent enough map for them to be one that they could definitely feel comfortable on. I wouldn't feel like they have to have much tactical depth on. I feel like they'd be questionable on Overpass, because I always thought Overpass was the fool's gold of that Immortals team. I realized they had a good win rate on it, and they definitely were able to beat teams around their level on it. But anytime I saw them versus elite teams, they only won on it for me when they just went ham and when they hit all their shots. So I never felt like they had the really good read on how to play the T side of this. They weren't tactical enough. I don't think this team would be very good on it. I don't think you can do just pure rushes. While there are a lot of rushes, especially on the B side of this map, you have to set them up with either really good read on when to do it, the timing, or amazing utility placement, so some innovation there, so teams don't just see a molly and then know where to dodge. And more importantly, you have to be able to set up the tactical site, which is the slow-paced A site, perhaps with an AWP even, before you can then make those bursts onto the B side. Otherwise, there'll be too many guys there and it gets too tough to do. So I don't think Overpass would be very good for them. And frankly, I think they would be bad on both Train and Nuke. I don't think those maps suit them at all. I think the tactical element of that, especially on what you have to do on T side, would just be beyond them. But you know what? We've got a solid enough map pool here. Plus, it's not like teams are emphasizing Train and Nuke anyway. So in terms of the style, I'm going to be up tempo here. I'm going to play off my stars. Yes, we're going to play off aim, but we're going to play off aggression, which is going to enable aim to not have to be as good, because we're going to put players on the other team in situations where they don't have a lot of time to react and to rotate. They don't have a lot of time to play a very disciplined team play, two-man game. We're just going to burst onto them and we're going to force them into these chaotic fights in smokes, through flashes, just three men rushing onto a site. I also think with this up-tempo style, we got a good mix of the aggression of Phelps and K&G that I want to really emphasize, but then we're going to anchor it with the smarts, the cerebral core of FNX, of Lucas, of Steele. Now, yes, the shot calling's not going to be amazing, so we don't want to have to make a lot of tough decisions, make a lot of key reads in the game. We want to make very simplistic reads, and then we want to attack and use aggression to brute force the door open, not use finesse to read the game and use utility to pull people off and make a flash and make a key pick here and know that the rotation will happen and move in without having to take a fight over here. We're not going to play like fucking Astralis. We're not going to have amazing set executes like North. We're going to leave this up to the individuals and the playmaking because we've got the right individuals and the right playmaking. I've created a Patreon, so if you're interested and able to support my work financially, then check out the link in the description box below and become a part of the Skrilluminati today.